The Schlieffen Plan, which had its roots in Kaiser Wilhelm II's failed diplomacy, was the German plan to win the war quickly. Now, once Kaiser Wilhelm III had alienated the Russians in the 1890s, as we saw in the previous lecture on the alliance system and the development of alliances in Europe, the German general staff realized that it would be fighting a two-front war. The Germans knew that the Russian military machine was antiquated and inefficient, and therefore anticipated that it would take about 6 weeks to mobilize. Now, based on these realities, General Alfred von Schlieffen devised the Schlieffen Plan between 1891 and 1905. Its first step would be to marshal 90% of the German forces on the Western Front to attack France. Because the French could probably expect the Germans to attack along their mutual border in the Ardennes, Schlieffen ordered a feint at this point. The main German column, 34 divisions, would attack France through neutral Belgium and Luxembourg. Now, once Paris surrendered, France would fall. Now, this fall would make possible the transfer of the German army to the Eastern Front just in time to meet the slowly mobilized Russians. The Russian army would prove no match for the Germans, and the Kaiser would then dictate peace terms to the whole of Europe. Now, immediately following the commencement of hostilities on the 2nd of August 1914, everything seemed to go well. Belgium and Luxembourg were easily overrun by the German army. The German Southern Army cut through the Ardennes, and by the end of August, German field artillery was shelling Paris. But at this point, two things went wrong. Because the Ardennes offensive was going so well, the Germans strengthened their southern army at the expense of the northern army. And the Russians mobilized far faster than anyone anticipated and invaded Prussia, forcing the Germans to pull men from the Western Front to shore up the east. And as a result, both Western offensives bogged down. Between the 6th and the 9th of September 1914, French and British forces stopped the German advance on Paris at the Battle of the Marne. Now, within 2 months, the German army in the west had been forced to retreat to a front running from Switzerland to the North Sea. Both sides dug in. Over the next 4 years, commanders on both sides of the Western Front launched offensive after offensive, hurling millions of men against enemy lines at tremendous loss of life at Champagne, Ypres, and Artois in 1915, Verdun and Somme in 1916, Arras, Champagne again, and Ypres again in 1917, and the Marne again, the Argonne, and Ypres again in 1918. Yet, the Western Front would budge no more than 10 miles in either direction during all that time. Now, why is this? The technology of early 20th century warfare favored the defensive side thanks to the concrete pillbox, barbed wire, and above all, the machine gun. Now, this technology was mounted at the front of an elaborate network of trenches that over time stretched back several miles. The two sets of trenches were separated from each other by about 300 to 600 yards of open ground, churned up mud that had been devastated by shells and grenades and was littered with human bodies, also known as no man's land. Now, given these formidable obstacles, why did the commanders on both sides repeatedly order their men over the top? Now, the commanders were professional soldiers, thoroughly trained in the 19th century warfare. Leaders on both sides had mostly attended military academies where they had studied the great wars and battles of the 18th and 19th centuries. If they had any experience of war at all, it was of colonial war, in which well-armed European forces had mown down tribal warriors armed with spears. Now, above all, most of the great commanders lacked the scientific and practical training to comprehend how the Second Industrial Revolution had changed their profession. Instead, war was seen as a kind of game, a great national sporting match with rules of play that gentlemen would, of course, follow, with victory coming through team spirit and redoubling of effort. Now consider Vitae Lampada by Henry Newbolt. Now, the Somme campaign of 1916 was perhaps the most disastrous of all the repeated offensives of the war. That summer, the French, who had just taken a terrible beating from the failed German offensive at Verdun, asked the British to take some pressure off their positions by undertaking to break the German lines at the River Somme near northern France. During the last year of June 1916, the British unleashed a massive artillery bombardment. At 7:30 a.m. on the 1st of July 1916, 1 million men of the British Expeditionary Force went over the top. The British Tommy faced tremendous obstacles as he ran across no man's land toward the enemy. He carried a rifle and a 16-pound pack. He had to cross 600 yards over his own side's barbed wire, then across ground plowed into the thick soup of heavy mud by rain and shell fire. He did so in the face of withering fire from German machine gunners. As a result, in one morning and one afternoon of fighting, the British Army lost a total of 57,740 casualties and gained only an average of 100 yards across a 16-mile front. Over the next 2 months, the Somme offensive gained a total of 2 to 3 miles at a cost of 420,000 total casualties. Sir Douglas Haig, far from being removed for incompetence, remained Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force to the end of the war, emerging after the war as a much decorated figure who was given the title of Earl Haig by King George V in 1919. Now, little was learned from the fiasco. In the summer of 1917, the British tried again at Ypres, losing 31,000 on the first day and 340,000 for the whole campaign. The Germans were no more intelligent. They killed 377,000 Frenchmen at Verdun, but at the loss of 337,000 Germans. Now, with the failure of these various offensives, Europe settled down to a cold-blooded war of attrition in the trenches. Life in the trenches was a nightmare. Above all, the trenches had mud everywhere, were cold and smelly, and bred influenza, bacterial infections, and trench foot. Dead men and horses lay where they fell, often only a few feet away, just over the top of a trench, or actually in the trench with the soldiers. The constant rounds of shell fire whistling overhead, making impact only a few yards away, had a devastating psychological effect, giving rise to a new psychological condition known as shell shock. Now, at one point in 1917, the life expectancy of a soldier at the Western Front was 2 weeks, as graphically portrayed in the novel Death of a Hero by Richard Aldington. For many Europeans, World War I, also known as the Great War, not the French Revolution, represented the true end of the Ancien Regime and indeed of Western civilization. World War I was, for Europeans, their Vietnam, like Americans' Vietnam. But because of its greater scale, it had an even more pronounced effect in Europe than Vietnam did in the United States. Ordinary men, not just intellectuals, ceased to believe in what they had been told, in their leaders, in their countries, and even in God. In many ways, the remainder of the 20th century would, for Europeans, be a search for the kind of certainty and a sense of belonging and purpose lost on the Western Front between 1914 and 1918. This can be seen in the art produced after the war. The writers of the Lost Generation, Eliot, Pound, Lawrence, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Yeats, Woolf, Joyce, Brecht, Kafka, and others, all depict in one way or another a kind of wasteland, as in Eliot's poem of 1923, devoid of divine purpose. Now, painting became even more abstract and fragmented. Music became more atonal and dissonant. And for the troops in the trenches, the only relief was the occasional leave home, which, as the poet Siegfried Sassoon depicted, produced its own problems. Sex with town prostitutes, subject of a famous World War I song, Mademoiselle from Armentières, and even black humor. Now, quite naturally, both sides sought a way to break out of this morass and win the war away from the Western Front, in the Mediterranean, at sea, and in the East.